Thank you for the invite. Just going to go straight into Tippah County Union Soldiers. We like our history to be neatly packaged, especially when it comes to conflict and opposing sides. Say, for instance, the struggle for Irish independence. We like to say Protestant versus Roman Catholic. Well, it turns out that in the 1700s, 1800s, and early 1900s, there were Protestants that were on board for Ireland to be separate from Great Britain. And then later, when the British allowed Catholics to become part of their civil service, a lot of the Roman Catholics in Northern Ireland were for British control. Similarly, in the Texas Revolution, we like to think of freedom-loving Scotch-Irish Texans, say John Wayne, the Alamo, versus thousands of serape-clad Mexicans fighting for a brutal dictator. Turns out there was actually a Hispanic component to the Texas independence movement called the Tianos, which were the old Spanish families, and they wanted to be separate from Mexico City, and they didn't like Santa Anna, and so they fought for Texas, and then they sort of eventually got forgot about until recently. The Civil War is no different. We think of North versus South, blue versus gray, Billy Yank versus Johnny Reb. Now I'm going to dive under the historic memory celebration tree, wrinkle the paper, loosen the ribbon, and untie the bows. It's estimated that over 100,000 white Southerners fought for the Union in the Civil War. Now, I'm gonna go with talk about mainly the white Tippah Countyans. I'm also looking in an ongoing project that I'm involved with. I'm also going to be looking at the United States colored troops from Tippah County, but trying to find sources on them are a bit difficult, and so it's just going to take a little bit more. It's going to take actually quite a bit more digging, and possibly a topic for another day. With this 100,000 white Southerners, this figure is drawn from the muster rolls of units that were formed in the South for the Union cause. By every state in the Confederacy produced a white Unionist unit, whether it be a battalion or a regiment, except South Carolina. Now there was individuals from South Carolina who fought for the Union, but they didn't produce a white Unionist regiment. The breakdown of this 100,000 shows Mississippi having 500 men serving in the Union Army. But this number comes from the muster roll of Mississippi's one and only white Unionist unit, the 1st Mississippi Mounted Rifle Battalion, which was composed of 5 companies. Originally it was 7 companies, but they couldn't make the 7, so they took what they had of the 2 and lumped them in with 5 companies. Tennessee had 30,000 men serving in over 30 regiments within the Union Army, while Alabama had one main non-African descent regiment, the 1st Alabama Cavalry, United States Volunteers. Mississippians, especially some Tippah Countyans, served in several of the Tennessee regiments and within the 1st Alabama. There were other Tippah Countyans who served in a handful of Illinois, Missouri, and even a Maryland regiment. And then, of course, there was the members of the 34th who were captured at Lookout Mountain, and they were when they were taken to the prison camps, they were given the opportunity to join the Union Army, and a handful of them did, and they were put in the 3rd United States Infantry. Now, when they would take these galvanized Yankees, they really didn't want to send them back south and fighting against their former Confederate comrades. So they would send them out west, where at the same time of the Civil War, there was an uprising with the Sioux in Minnesota and Iowa. And then sometimes they would put them in the forts up north, like Garden, Washington, or there's even forts up in New York. Now I got started on this list trying to document Union soldiers from Tippah County. And how it sort of came about, I had posted an update on my ancestors' Find a Grave page. Isaac Nathan Meeks, and all the lists, all the research lists, having been in the 23rd Mississippi Infantry Regiment. And so I posted this update and said, yeah, he was in the 23rd Mississippi Infantry, but he was also in the 18th Missouri Volunteer Infantry, U.S. And so after I posted it, Jerry contacted me and said, hey, well, what's going on here? And so I told him, I said, well, he was in the Union Army. And he's like, well, was he captured and forced into serving? And I was like, no, he volunteered. He had signed a 1-year enlistment, and the 23rd went to the Kentucky Panhandle, and he got sick. Well, he was sent to hospital. The 23rd was later captured and sent to a prison camp, Fort Donelson. And so he wound up getting out of the hospital, and the 23rd was not exchanged until fairly on up into 1862. And I think they did like try and reform the 23rd, but he wasn't involved. He waited out the war through about midpoint in the war, and then he joined the 18th Missouri Infantry, which their camp at the time, they were posted at Chihuahua. And they would conduct reconnaissance patrols towards Hatchie and Muddy Creek, and even coming down to Braid Ripley. So he joined the 18th. He caught some of the last battles for Atlanta. He marched. He was in Sherman's army in the March to the Sea up through the Carolinas. And he wound up at the surrender of Army of Tennessee at Greensboro, North Carolina. And he possibly marched in the Grand Review of Union Forces down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. So on paper, about 3,000 Tippah Countyans served in the Confederate military. I estimate that 150 to 200 served in the Union Army. Andrew Brown commented in his history of Tippah County that we'd probably never know the number of Tippah County Unions. He found that apparent support for the Union cause peaked in mid-1862 and mid-1863, but declined in 1864. Union sentiment was stronger in the north part of the county, especially around Jonesboro. Although Brown believed Tippah County Unionists were an annoyance rather than an actual threat to Confederate military, he points out that Union troops seemed to show up within the county and in Ripley at badly timed moments for pro-Confederate residents and soldiers. Brown he reflected the lost cause view of the Civil War within his Tippah County history, the Civil War chapters, which lost cause historians have had a hard time trying to explain Southern Unionists and Southern Unionism. One of the most famous cases of a lost cause historian trying to deal with Southern Unionism is University of Alabama historian William Stanley Hoole from the early to mid 20th century. When working on Alabama Confederate regimental histories, he had to look at the 1st Alabama Cavalry, United States Volunteers. He surmised that they were poor, underprivileged, isolated in rocky highlands, suspicious of outsiders, antisocial, and being have-nots, blindly hating the haves. Hoole did not do his research. The 1st Alabama recruited from the West Georgia Piedmont and the Chattahoochee Valley to North Mississippi, West Tennessee, and Middle Tennessee, and then everything in between. And also, many of the members of the 1st Alabama were actually fairly well property. Now, why would Southerners fight for the Union? Bear in mind that we're fairly close to Old Tishomingo and Etowah counties. And those counties initially voted when the first call was made for Mississippi to secede. They voted against secession in the secession convention. And then Natchez too. We always think of Natchez with the big antebellum houses and the plantations. That area wasn't too excited about leaving the Union. A lot of its businessmen, the millionaires you always hear about, they had business connections up north. They also traded overseas. That would be disrupted. And I feel sure that they had visited the North and they saw what the North could do. But as far as this area, it just wasn't a heavy plantation area like the Delta or Tombigbee River Plain. So really not much, it's not much of in the way of slaves or the tara, as we would think. And we're located from northeast Mississippi, North Alabama, North Georgia, East Tennessee. We're located in the Upland South, what's called the Upland South, and this area was patriotic to the U.S. to begin with. They recognized Andrew Jackson as one of their own, and you remember he fought really hard, especially with John C. Calhoun, to keep the southern states from breaking away. In fact, there's a famous incident in a dinner party honoring in memory of Thomas Jefferson, where Calhoun raises his glass, proposes a toast, where he says he toasts the state's ability to go its own way and the state's rights. And when he sits down, Jackson gets up and very firmly with his glass, toasts, the federal union must be preserved. And people in this Upland South region, they had ancestors who participated in the Revolution and such battles like Kings Mountain and Cowpens. And then also they had family who fought in the War of 1812 and say the Battle of New Orleans when the Kentuckians and Tennesseans shot up the British at New Orleans. Now, one of the things that really pushed a lot of Southerners into the Union ranks was the conscript law, which in it said that if you own 20 or more slaves, you were exempt from service. And it really rubbed a lot of the Southern soldiers, or those thinking about going into the military, the wrong way. And one of my favorite books, Samuel Watkins's Company H, he was in the 1st Tennessee Infantry, Confederate Infantry. He wrote, when the conscript law came out, from this time on till the end of the war, a soldier was simply a machine, a conscript. It was mighty rough on the rebels. We cursed the war, we cursed Bragg, we cursed the Southern Confederacy. All our pride and valor had gone, and we were sick of war in the Southern Confederacy. A law was made by the Confederate States Congress about the time allowing every person who owned 20, and I'm going to dub in slaves here, to go home. It gave us the blues. We wanted 20 slaves. Slave property suddenly became very valuable, and there was raised the howl of rich man's war, poor man's fight. The glory of the war, the glory of the South, the glory and pride of our volunteers had no charms for conscript. So kind of going back, kind of touching on what Hoole said, did the Alabama histories, there is kind of a grudge between people in hill countries and the flatlands or delta or tidewater area. But then class and wealth participation in the Civil War, which side you took, it more depended on where you were in the South. What's the real estate slogan? Location, location, location. And then eventually with the fall of Vicksburg, the defeat at Gettysburg, failed assaults against federal posts in the Mid-South, such as the attack on Hernando, well, actually a couple attacks on Hernando that failed. There was began to be among Southerners a loss of faith in the Confederate cause. And then also when you're looking at the armies, you can see a safety in numbers because in the Federal Army, you have these full 800 to 1,000 man regiments. And I'd rather want to be in with them when the shooting starts than say maybe a 300 or 400 man regiment that was just kept on dwindling down, dwindling down, dwindling down. Because towards the end, a lot of the Confederate regiments, they're thrown to get like 3 or 4 regiments are thrown together into a consolidated regiment because they had lost so many men. And then you have the harassment by local Confederate partisans and recruiting parties. And of course we get the stories of Faulkner Street going in, taking out the able-bodied men, but then wound up the partisans were eventually got upset because Richmond wanted to bring the names of the partisans or the soldiers who were in the partisan units. They wanted to bring them into the main military and send them to Virginia or send them to Georgia. So they wanted the names of the partisans to be on the rolls of potential recruits for the regular regiments. And in fact, there's a case where Faulkner receives word that there's agents from Richmond coming to Ripley. At the time he had his 7th Mississippi Cavalry or 1st Partisans here. And he hears that they're coming and they're going to take our names and they're possibly going to throw us into the Army of Northern Virginia or regular Army of Tennessee, and we won't be protecting our homes. So Faulkner tells his men to go hide. And they do. The agents from Richmond come, and there's nobody to talk with, and they wind up heading back to Richmond. Well, then right after that, the 7th Kansas comes in and attacks and loots Ripley. So there was problems with the partisans, and then of course with with the Union Army, when you join, you receive a bounty. And it was a considerable amount of money for the time. And you also have to think back to inflation was really rampant in the Confederacy. The Confederate money was just was not good. And in fact, the price of goods like sugar, coffee were just soaring. And I think there's even like a chart in Brown's book about how much things cost in Tippah County at the time. And during the Civil War, the Union they were trying to stabilize their currency. They had sort of the same situation where banks, states, railroad companies were issuing money, but then there was an attempt to try and bring it all together and just have a national currency. And of course, we get the greenbacks that you hear so often about. And then also just the sheer desolation of that was going on during the war, the ravages of war. You had foodstuffs that potentially would be going to civilian population being sent to the military. And I've got a letter here that was up for auction a couple of years ago from a private John W. Boston, Company G, 81st Ohio Volunteers, who is camped in Corinth. And he wrote to his family, "There are some of the rebels coming in every day or more or less and joining our army, and they say that the war cannot last over a few months at the furthest, for there is not much grain raised in more southern states, and that they will not be able to raise a crop to sustain the army and their families this summer." Now he's writing on February the 20th, 1863. The whole state of Mississippi is overrun by the ravages. The whole state of Mississippi is overrun by the ravages of the armies of the North and South, and as almost every other of the border states and the rebel armies is pillaging their own dear subjects to keep them alive, and then barely can make it out, for there are any amount of them deserting and coming into our lines. There was some 60 come in from the army of the rebels at Vicksburg, and so Vicksburg hadn't fallen yet, fallen July. Now I'm just going to provide a thumbnail sketch of the federal units with Tippah Countyans in them. With the fall of Forts Henry and Donelson and the capture of Nashville, and then especially later with the capture of Corinth in May 1862, this made it possible for Union sympathizers to join the Union Army ranks. The surrender of Memphis in June 1862 also provided opportunity for Mid-Southern Unionists to join both the Federal Army and River Navy. After securing Corinth and Memphis, the Union military spread throughout the West Tennessee and North Mississippi countryside, establishing posts at places like Ramsey, Chewalla, Collierville, and there was even a post up at Big Hill, where Big Hill Park is now, just over the Tennessee state line. And these were mainly to watch the rail lines. The first Union troops showed up in Tippah County in late June, early July 1862. A Michigan Cavalry Regiment came in through Ripley on June the 27th, I believe from Ramsey. A few days later, General William S. Rosecrans, who would be the Union commander at Corinth during the October 3rd and 4th Battle of Corinth, brought an infantry brigade to Ripley. Now, units raised with Tippah Countyans, which actually were mainly cavalry, participated in raiding, reconnaissance, flank guard, and screening the army on the march. Our first unit is the 1st Alabama Cavalry. Now, majority of the men, although they were drawn from Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, most of them were from North Alabama. And it's raised in mid-1862 with recruits first meeting in Huntsville and later Memphis. Then they went on into the federal garrison at Corinth. For a while they had a camp at Glen, outside going towards Iuka. But later moved to Camp Dodge at Chihuahua, Tennessee. In fact, they came in just after the 18th Missouri left to go to Georgia. And then,
I'm sorry.
That's good. We camped out, we camped in the wilderness.
Yeah.
Shoot that bird.
And and as I mentioned before, Camp Dodge was a staging post for reconnaissance patrols towards Hatchie River and Muddy Creek and Braves here. The first went on to conduct raids in Alabama. They eventually joined Sherman's Atlanta campaign and marched to the sea and rode through the Carolinas and was present at Joseph Johnston's surrender of the Army of Tennessee in North Carolina, Greensboro. The 1st West Tennessee Cavalry Regiment, aka the 6th Cavalry Regiment, was from McNairy, Hardin, Wayne, Weakley, Decatur, and Perry counties, but had Tippah Countyans within its ranks. Now this is the cavalry regiment that was raised by Colonel Fielding Hurst, and he's a local legend in the Selmer area, and here as well. He was a strong advocate for keeping Tennessee in the Union, and then Eisenhower Harris had him locked up. And then when the Union came in and took Nashville, they released him, and then he later cornered Andrew Johnson, who was the Union governor of Tennessee, cornered Andrew Johnson about raising a regiment of Tennesseans for the Union. And I think the way it was described, I read it, was he literally had Johnson cornered, and Johnson was like, okay, go back and raise your regiment. And so he went back. The federal authorities didn't take him, or military didn't take him seriously. And so some of the first men in the 1st West Tennessee Cavalry Regiment actually paid for some of the equipment and uniforms from their own pocket. And so the 6th Tennessee was especially active around Jonesboro and Pocahontas. And at one point they captured some of Soul Street's partisans near Pocahontas and threatened to hang them. General James Chalmers had to intervene, which Street exactly didn't want, because the two didn't see eye to eye over authority issues. But Chalmers wound up writing to federal officers, higher ranking officers, and Street's men were not hung. And in fact, I think they went on and they torched Jackson, Tennessee, a time or two, and at an early point in the war, before Sherman came up with his total war, and there was still, when Jackson was torched, it was still kind of the gentlemanly war, and the soldiers of Hurst's regiment actually had their pay docked by the U.S. military to compensate for the destruction of Jackson. During a raid on Ripley, the 6th killed a local Pontotoc Confederate cavalry commander and Presbyterian preacher Reverend John H. Miller. He just happened to pop up wrong time, wrong day, and was killed by a raid by the 6th. By late 1863, Mississippi and West Tennessee Unionists petitioned to raise more federal units, which led to the raising of the 1st Mississippi Rifle Battalion. By late 1864, though Corinth is nearly out of the picture as far as the Union war effort is concerned. With the eventual federal abandonment of Corinth, Memphis became an important recruiting center for Mid-South Unionists. This mounted battalion contained about 28 or 30 Tippah The first duty of the 1st Mississippi was an excursion via steamer to South Mississippi. I think they were conducting reconnaissance and skirmishing with Wirt Adams's cavalry in South Mississippi. They came back to Memphis and later participated in the late summer 1864 Andrew Jackson's Whiskey Smith expedition that culminated in the burning of Oxford. In fact, they were actually posted north of town, and it was Kansas soldiers that rode in and did most of the destruction, burnt the square, burnt Jacob Thompson's house across from Roanoke. In December 1864, the 1st came through Ripley, riding on to head a part of John Bell Hood's Army of Tennessee supplies at Verona in Egypt Station. And that's bad timing for John Bell Hood and the Army of Tennessee. What just happened? Franklin and Nashville. Towards the end of the war, they crossed the Mississippi River, patrolling and conducting raids in Arkansas and Missouri. The 1st Mississippi Mounted Rifles had the highest ranking Tippah that I've come across, and that was 1st Lieutenant P.D. or B.D. Stevens. Several men from the western part of Tippah County served in a late war Tennessee Mounted Regiment. These men specifically served in Company B, 4th Mississippi Mounted Infantry. This company was raised in the Mid-South, although the rest of the regiment was raised in other parts of Tennessee and saw service in Central Tennessee. In fact, Dr. South has brought a photograph of her ancestor, Sergeant James M. Witten, who was a member of the 4th Tennessee Mounted Infantry. Ironically, some Tippah served in the 11th Illinois Volunteer Cavalry, especially within companies I and F. This regiment was originally raised around the Peoria, Illinois area. And when it had Tippah in it, and get this, they were camped and sometimes brigaded with the 1st Alabama Cavalry, and occasionally the 1st Alabama Cavalry would actually come over and ask for Tippah who were serving in the 11th Illinois to go on detached service, especially if they were riding through Tippah County and patrolling. And one of the men that would go on these patrols was Private William B. Rowland. There was a whole family of Rowlands in the north part of the county that was members of the 11th Illinois. And in fact, William Rowland, this is one of the interesting things I've stumbled across in my research. Sometimes they took aliases, these Unionists, and his name that he used through the war was Benjamin Proctor. So what happened to these men, the Southern Unionists? After the war, Reconstruction authorities soon turned away from these loyalists in an effort to better assist the freedmen and their families. The government did not initially compensate Southern Unionists nor offer protection for property and person. Many left their home areas, like a family of Unionist Settlemeyers from Tippah County, and I'm sure they are connected to some of the Settlemeyers around Collegiate and Ruckersville. But some of them just moved to like Arkansas or Tennessee. Some were killed after returning home in other parts of the South. The Southern Unionists eventually felt abandoned from the Republican Party. Redeeming governments, the carpetbag governments, were corrupt and did not help. The redeeming governments, on the other hand, they remembered some of these Southern Unionists in the heavy pro-federal areas. And from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, they would actually like neglect certain areas, like a state legislature would neglect certain areas of the state, because they remembered they didn't support the Confederacy. And in fact, Alabama, North Alabama, it's like mid 20th century, before a lot of infrastructure and internal improvement is made in North Alabama, because Central and South Alabama still held the grudge. Many Southern Union men and their families grew poor after the war. And in fact, the colonel commander of the First West Tennessee or Sixth Hurst, he died penniless. Eventually, the Southern Unionists' children and grandchildren married into Confederate veterans' families, easily forgetting their Union ancestors' Civil War service, experience, and sacrifice. Thank you.
Good.
Any questions?
2 Union soldiers buried over here in Larian. Where's his last name?
Tudor. Yeah.
The Tudor family.
Yeah,
Tudor.
Yeah, Tudor.
Do you know where they were killed or where they were from?
Let's see, someone was asking me about that the other day, and I was thinking they were killed like during the fighting through the streets when the Union were pulling back. They weren't.
Battle, Wit and Branch.
Wit and Branch.
And there was a Midwestern and a Western cavalry, and they probably came from one of those, like Illinois and Iowa, something like that. I'd like to know. I'd be glad to have it put on the old segregation fence that they put around their graves. I'd be glad to put their units. I've even written to those, to the corresponding northern camps, and nobody replied. I thought maybe they'd like to know where these men died and were buried, but I heard nothing.
There is a chapter of Sons of Union Veterans at Savannah and Memphis too, and a lot of things like that. They like to work on a local level, so these are. It's been a while since I've been out there. They're unknown.
But they do have U.S. tombstones that were put under unknown. But they did die at the Battle of Wit and Branch, same as their Confederate soldier buried back in the side of Antioch Road. Died in the same skirmish.
And there's a gentleman that's been in touch with me that wants us to re-engrave his stone and put his name on it. You know, the boy from
Alabama.
that was visiting his father and died in his place.
Took his place, yeah.
Yeah, and I told him there was no sentiment for it in the Historical Society. I mean,
He's memorable.
it's an unknown soldier as far as I'm concerned. But I told him if he would like to raise money and place a new stone, we'd sure help him do it. I mean, that'd be all right.
Hadn't heard from him since.
That would be interesting, but a lot of times it's unknown. It's just at a loss. Just trying to figure. Well, I would try and figure out what Union regiments were out there, and then from that Wit and Branch, and then from that, try and figure out,
It was Whiskey Smith's boys coming through, came through Yellow Rabbit, killed some people there and came down.
Oh, he had a brigade.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of folks.
Who actually came through after the Battle of Bryce's and burned all this stuff? Who actually did it?
J. Whiskey Smith.
Well, see, Bryce's Crossroad was straight.
Yeah, at that time they chased the drones back to White Station, and then a month later they came.
Oh, okay, yeah, Sturgis
Right.
came through, going to Bryce's Crossroads and came barreling back.
It was right after the Battle of Wit and Branch when they built Rock Ridgeway.
Yeah,
Mhm.
there's the courthouse.
Oh, okay. I don't know where that fit in.
Let's see, I always get Smith, there was another Smith, there was Suey Smith. I always have to keep it straight. Suey Smith, Sturgis, and straight, and Whiskey Smith.
Whiskey Smith. Thank you, John, appreciate it.
Mark?
I can't help but take advantage of this situation to bring in my own personal environment, I guess. I grew up in Memphis, a staunch rebel fighting for the South, hoping that the war would come back and we would rise and win the war the next time. And starting in the 5th grade, I started digging on the family history because my 5th grade teacher was an old professional unmarried school teacher, and her hobby was genealogy. And she sent us home to dig on the family history, find out what we could. And when I went home and cornered my father, he said, "Oh, you don't want to know that. You certainly don't want to know that." But what he was talking about, his grandfather, my great-grandfather, was named William Alexander Alsop, and he had murdered a man on the railroad tracks 1 mile north of Faulkner. In 1875, he was attempting to rape the man's wife. When the man came up and caught him, and he jumped up, pulled a gun out of his belt, and shot him through the heart, killing him instantly. Anyway, that's just a little sideline, but my 2 great-grandfathers, William Alexander Alsop, the murderer, and his father, William Newton Alsop, my great-great-grandfather on the Alsop side, were both Union soldiers. One was in the Missouri Ozarks of Douglas County, Missouri. William Alexander Alsop was conscripted in 1864 into the Confederate Army. He was, for some reason, didn't want to fight in the war, and he resented being conscripted into the Confederate Army. They took him to Grenada, Mississippi, where he refused to do anything they said, and they put him in the stockade. He tunneled his way out after years digging with a spoon from his meal kit, walked the 80 or 100 miles to Memphis and joined the Union Army in June of 1864, and was released in June of 1865. In that same company was my other grandfather on my Alsop side, whose name was John Henry Moore. His father, who was my great-great-grandfather and my grandmother Tippersville Moore Alsop, was also he was in the Illinois. Eli Moore was his name, and he was in the Illinois company you mentioned a few minutes ago. Anyway, it was enough to make an avid genealogist give up when he found out all 4 of his grandfathers were soldiers.
Yeah, Alex also, and the younger Moore was, they were in the 1st Mississippi Mounted Rifles.
I think I told John a while ago, they were released at the same time in Memphis in June 20-something, I think, of 1865, and they all the Tippah Countyans who had been in that unit started walking home. Evidently, none of them had any transportation other than walking. And on the way, good old Ellick, who was always a black sheep of the family, got into an argument with John Henry, who was to be his relative by marriage later on, and they got so mad at each other, they would have killed each other if they had proper weapons still with them at the time.
Since you're not yourself, have you ever heard about the ghost in Wittentown or Shady Grove, about the two
No.
guys hired some Confederate payroll? Have you ever heard?
Oh, yeah.
My cousin,
I've heard, a lot of people don't know, and I was just wondering if, trying to get it more sustained.
I'm gonna have to do more. I just I sent an email to a former professor of mine where I briefly mentioned the Battle of Wit and Branch, and when I was just grabbing a date and stuff, and I'm gonna have to do more reading on Wit and Branch.
Well, I've heard this for years, a long time ago. Maybe that's something, but you could tell me how she's heard it, that there was two Confederates that had the Confederate payroll. They were they knew they were gonna get captured, and they buried it somewhere out in Wittentown or Shady Grove. They were captured, and somehow or another these guys knew it. And they tortured them endlessly, trying to get them to tell where they buried this Confederate payroll. Well, story goes, legend has it, that they never told. And at a certain night, at certain times of the year, you could hear this wailing in the agony and the crying of these soldiers that gave up their life to hide it. And I've always heard that was out there in Wittentown or Shady Grove. What have you heard about it?
Well, over there on what we call the Thorn Place, was located on a stagecoach route between Ripley and what?
Finger?
No, it would be, of course, Ashland actually didn't even exist then, it was, yeah, Ripley did, yeah. And the Thorn family had like a hotel or a place where people could stop and spend the night. And it's over there in the Wittentown area, and that property is in my family now. Over there is buried a private John Thorne, and they've done a new headstone for him because after the logging took place over there, the family cemetery was vandalized up in the woods. I still have the original headstone from him. He died on the first day of the Battle of First Manassas. Anyway, he's over there in Wittentown buried. They actually brought his body back and buried it. He was only in his 20s. But anyway, the tradition around there is there's gold buried there somewhere. And my mother said, I don't want to hear about that because your daddy spent half of our married life over there digging. She said, he dug that whole 320 acres up looking for that gold and never found it. So, I mean, that's, but that still persists, that there's gold buried up there somewhere.
You know, it's just amazing to me that they could leave here, travel all the way to Manassas, retrieve a body somehow or another, and then trek all the way back to that. It just amazes me how they could, the time and the effort.
Well, that's when embalming was first becoming, I mean, I guess the Civil War is what led to the, improvements in the, being able to embalm bodies. So many scientific and medical advancements are made in wartime. It's amazing. We talked about that the other day.
Got a lot
But-
of people to play with.
Yeah, a lot of raw material there. But anyway, they did bring his body back, that was before the war got really, really, really heated, and they.
Yeah, they could. Yeah, well, it was it was going to be over, and
Oh, that was supposed to be over
yeah,
there.
they was the 90-day volunteers, and it was just going to be over with, and his people like Sherman, this is going to be longer than what you think, and they called Sherman crazy. There was some issues there, but before that, they would, if they were going to transport a body, say for instance, General Pakenham, who led the British forces at New Orleans, they wound up putting his body in a cask of rum to transport it back to England.
Well, one question I had after y'all were talking about somebody getting a headstone, like I said, Private John Thorne, headstone that his family erected having been broken, the Sons of Confederate Veterans here sent off and had him a new one made, which we have, and at this several years ago they said they were gonna, come and erect it. It's way up in the woods, very remote, in that family cemetery. But I guess, it just fell by the wayside. Anyway, I have the stone and we haven't put it up. But when you ask about this man wanting a stone for his ancestor, I mean, isn't there a mechanism for getting those?
It wouldn't be any trouble to get a stone, but he wants us to take down or change our unknown stone, and I'm just not thrilled about that.
Oh, well.
Well, how about just having it engraved on the bottom of it, or on the top, wherever there's room, that you found the name?
You can chair the committee, I mean, it'll be.
You gotta remember that next time.
I'm all for it if you are.
Well, I know one time I ordered a War 1812 tombstone from my 34th great-grandpa. And he buried somewhere and died in Hardeman County, Tennessee, but his wife's over here in Antioch, the one baby, you know what I'm talking about, the Job family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I got one from the VA, War of 1812, and after, before I erected it, I wanted to tuck it up here, a little fake crumb. And I said, died in Hardeman County, Tennessee. The burial place is unknown, but they're sitting there beside his wife.
Well, I told the man to please go ahead, and we don't want to change the stone we've got, but you raise the money or send off, get it, send it here, and we will put it up for you, another one. But I'm just sure there's some unknown soldiers, Confederate soldiers ought to be remembered for the Battle of Wit and Branch, and I'd like to leave it there.
Good ceremony.
It sure was. Didn't we have a good time?
Pretty morning.
I made a mistake of telling a friend not long ago, I really enjoyed that funeral. He said, did you say enjoy? I said, well, yeah, I
You
did.
had that echo taps that tapped
Yes.
back in the woods.
Yes,
You could hear it
sir.
come over the head, you didn't know where it was coming from, that was 24 notes.
And the train that came by,
Yeah,
that helped a lot too,
yeah.
yeah.
The one train
It's interesting to me about the treatment, because, I learned from my grandmother, that this was a picture of her grandfather. And, she said, but now, he was a Yankee. It's like, we don't wanna know anything about that, And, so I asked about why he looked like that, and, she said, well, he had just come back from the war, and he had never grown a beard before, but he had a full beard, and his hair, she said his hair was just really, really long, and it was almost like piled on top of his head. I guess he just put it up under his cap or whatever, and really just took the stuff he brought home and hid it and never talked about it anymore. I guess that was the only way you could survive in this area.
And of course in the north, they form GAR, Grand Army of the Republic posts for the veterans. And there were some in the south. There was actually a post at Selmer, but that was fairly heavy Union area. And so, but my ancestors, same way. It's just like, come home and don't talk to nobody. And then when the Meekses, his name was Isaac Nathan Meeks, and his daughter married into the Rutherfords, which I'm a descendant of Sheriff James McCall Rutherford, who is a lieutenant in Company A, 34th Mississippi. When the family would be at the dinner table, it would be all the Rutherford family stories. And then when my great grandmother would say, well, my daddy's a Union man, and she would, when she went to vote, she got a Republican ticket. And in a day and age when everybody's still voting, around here, you know, it's a strong Democrat, and everybody be, well, that's nice, I guess. But now, let's talk about Rutherford locking up Thurman after Faulkner's assassination, and then they went on, and then it was just a way later I found out about great-great-grandpa Meeks. And so, and then his tombstone is, he's buried. The tombstone is joint with his both him and his wife Ann Drury Meeks, and so there's like no military, just a private civilian tombstone up at Smyrna. Any more?
Grandmother probably said, I don't know.
Oh, I did forget about, bring a bullet that was found back in the 1980 up around Chihuahua. This is my pet bullet. And yeah.
I got a pet bullet.
Oh,
They came from Corinth, I heard.
Oh.
And when I talked to the ladies the other day, I told them, we looked it up first, and to be sure it was a .775 or something like that. And they said they took 3 of them out of Stonewall Jackson's arm, 2 in his, maybe 2 in his hand, maybe 1 here, 1 there, broke his shoulder.
I mean, those things were made, you know, when it hit. I mean, no wonder there's so many amputations.
Sure,
and stuff, you
sure,
know,
the thing tumbled and made a hole, and when it came out the other end, it must have made a hole about that big around.
And I did have a sort of a serendipitous moment.
Make some pictures.
I did have a serendipitous moment happen a couple of years ago at the Civil War show on sale at Corinth. There is a musket, I think it's now at Barry's Trading Post, but one of the relics dealers in Corinth got a hold of a musket, a Springfield rifle musket, 1861 model. And they said, well, this musket might have been used at Corinth. The soldier was garrisoned in Corinth. And so he had it on display at the Civil War show and sale at Corinth 2 or 3 years ago. And it turned out, it belonged to a guy from the Midwest, from actually Missouri, but I think he moved off to Oklahoma or Kansas after the war. The guy was in not only the very same regiment, the 18th Missouri Volunteer Infantry, he was in the same company as my great-great-grandfather, the Company C of the 18th. And so a friend of mine does some historical interpreting around Corinth and Shiloh, and he knows that I'm interested in the 18th Missouri. We've got an ancestor in the 18th, which there's only one group of Civil War reenactors, American Civil War reenactors in the hobby, in the reenacting hobby that portray the 18th, and it's a 25 or 30 man group in Great Britain. And this friend of mine sometimes goes over and joins them in reenactments, American Civil War reenactments in Great Britain, portraying the 18th Missouri. And so when I walked through the door, he made a beeline towards me and he said, "You got to come and see this." And sure enough, there was that Springfield rifled musket that was in same company, same regiment, one like my great-great-grandfather would have toted.
That makes your hair stand up.
It does, it does. Well, I'm gonna give y'all, I have been working on this list, compiling this list of Tippah County, Tippah Countyans and federal service during the Civil War. And just to warn you, it's an ongoing project. They're coming out of the woodwork, and I'm sure there's gonna be more, and this will be updated. So I'm gonna give this to y'all. Is this gonna be in the museum or the library for further updates?
We are making steady progress, with, the Criswells in getting us a place in the archive to start storing our material. In the meantime, if you'd like to have that placed in the library, let's do it.
Okay.